So we have a civilization, we have a god king, we have a capital city rising out of the jungle on the shores of a lake that floods backward once a year. Now the question is, how do you feed 1 million people? Because that's what Angkor was eventually going to need. And the answer the Khmer came up with was so ambitious, so complex, and quietly brilliant that engineers are still studying it today. It started with a simple observation. The land around Angkor was extraordinarily fertile. The Tonle Sap flooded every year, dumped its nutrients into the soil, and pulled back. Rice grew. Fish were everywhere. The foundations for a large population were already there. But as the city grew, the natural flood cycle wasn't enough anymore. Too much water at the wrong time destroyed crops. Too little water in the dry season meant fields sat empty for months. What the Khmer needed was control, not just of their kingdom, but of the water itself. And so they built something that had never been attempted anywhere on Earth at this scale. If you could somehow rise above ancient Angkor and look down, what you'd see wouldn't look like a city, it would look like a circuit board. The entire landscape, for kilometers in every direction, would be etched with perfectly straight lines, channels and canals and inlets catching the light as they carried water to every corner of the agricultural grid below. At the heart of this system sat 2 enormous reservoirs called Barays. The numbers are almost difficult to process. The West Baray alone measured roughly 8 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide, the surface area of about 2,000 football pitches. The East Baray was only slightly smaller. Together, they held enough water to irrigate the entire city through months of dry season, and enough capacity to absorb the overflow when the monsoon went too far. And here's the thing that makes it even more impressive. The Khmer didn't dig these reservoirs out of the earth. They built up. They heaved millions of cubic meters of soil into enormous embankments, some of them 100 meters wide and 10 meters tall, and then redirected rivers and canals to fill the space behind them. No mechanical equipment, no modern tools, just human labor on a scale that is genuinely hard to picture. The West Baray still holds water today. The East Baray dried up centuries ago, and farmers now grow crops on what used to be its bed. But from the air, both outlines are still clearly visible, 2 of the largest human constructions on Earth, and among the few ancient structures you can actually see from space. The canals connecting everything weren't random either. When the engineers wanted a slow, controlled flow, they used channels with multiple bends built in. When they wanted fast, direct delivery, they cut long, straight canals that moved water with purpose. Lock gates, most likely wood, long since rotted away, gave them even finer control over exactly where the water went and when. A Chinese visitor writing in the 14th century described what this system made possible in a single understated sentence. He noted that for 6 months of the year, the land had no rain at all, and yet crops could be harvested 3 or 4 times a year. 3 or 4 harvests a year in a region with a 6-month dry season. That is what engineering can do. This agricultural engine powered everything. It fed the workers who built the temples, it funded the armies that defended the borders, it filled the royal treasury that paid for the next generation of construction, and it allowed Angkor to grow into something genuinely without parallel in the medieval world. While London was home to fewer than 20,000 people in the 11th century, central Angkor alone may have held 250,000. The wider city and its farmland, all of it connected by that vast web of canals, supported at least 1 million. And those people needed temples. Every village in the empire had one, and these weren't just places of worship. Each temple was also an administrative center, run by a powerful local family who collected taxes from the surrounding area, kept a portion for themselves, and funneled the rest back to the royal treasury in Angkor. The more they sent to the king, the higher their status, so they competed, clearing land, expanding farms, squeezing every drop of agricultural capacity out of the landscape.
It was a brilliantly efficient system, and like most brilliantly efficient systems, it contained the seeds of its own destruction. The forests came down fast, the soil eroded. The peasants who actually worked the land paid the price, while the temple families got richer. But that was a problem for later. For now, the empire was at its peak, and at its peak, it built something that stopped even hardened European explorers in their tracks centuries after it was abandoned: Angkor Wat. By some estimates, it is the largest religious structure ever built by human hands, 4 times the size of Vatican City, constructed from somewhere in the region of 10 million sandstone blocks, each one weighing up to 1.5 tons, quarried from the sacred Kulin Hills 40 kilometers to the north, cut from the bedrock by teams using iron tools, and floated down to the construction site on barges traveling the Great Canal network. The total volume of stone used to build Angkor Wat exceeds the Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza, and if you add up the stone used across the entire city of Angkor, it surpasses every pyramid in Egypt combined. The blocks are fitted together without mortar, shaped so precisely that in many places the gaps between them are invisible to the naked eye. When the French explorer Henri Montt was shown the ruins in the 19th century, with vines wrapped around the towers and monkeys moving through the galleries, he wrote back to the colonial authorities and said it was grander than anything left to us by Greece or Rome, a rival to Solomon's temple, erected by some ancient Michelangelo. He wasn't exaggerating. Angkor Wat was built as a representation of Mount Meru, the sacred mountain at the center of the Hindu universe, home of the gods. Its 5 towers are designed to look like lotus buds on the verge of blooming. A moat 5 kilometers around it represents the cosmic ocean. 3 rising galleries represent the mountain's ascending levels. The whole thing is a cosmological diagram in stone, a model of the universe built at a scale that makes you feel small standing in front of it. And it was built in under 37 years. At the same time in Europe, the Normans were taking centuries to finish their cathedrals. The king who commissioned it was Suryavarman II, and he ruled in the early 11th century. His passion for construction gave the world one of its most enduring wonders. His passion for warfare gave the Khmer Empire some of its most expensive disasters. To put it plainly, Suryavarman loved going to war and was remarkably bad at it. He had his sights on the coastal kingdoms to the east, Champa, the old rival of the Khmer, and Dai Viet, the kingdom of the Viet people in what is now northern Vietnam. Rich trade routes ran down these coastlines from China, and Suryavarman wanted a piece of them. He invaded 3 times. He lost 3 times. In 1128, he marched 20,000 soldiers against Dai Viet and was decisively beaten, barely making it back to Angkor alive. In 1145, he invaded Champa with slightly more success. He took the capital, killed the king, and installed his own man on the throne. But as various armies have discovered across centuries of trying, Vietnam is extremely difficult to hold on to once you've taken it. His puppet king lasted about 5 years before Cham rebels threw him out. When Suryavarman marched back in to help, his army was beaten again. The inscriptions from this period go quiet on the subject, which tells you everything. It's thought Suryavarman might have died somewhere on that last campaign, whether from battle, disease, or ambush, nobody recorded. What he left behind was a kingdom that had spent enormous resources on wars it couldn't win, a treasury that had been drained funding expeditions that came back empty-handed, and, most critically, no clear heir to the throne. In Cambodia, no clear heir meant one thing: civil war. Of the 27 rulers of Angkor across its entire history, only 16 ever had a legitimate claim to the throne. The rest took it by force or maneuvering. After Suryavarman died, a cousin grabbed power and the familiar pattern repeated: factions forming, loyalties splitting, armies choosing sides. For the next 30 years, the Khmer state stumbled through a succession of increasingly weak rulers, rebellions from within, and pressure from enemies on the borders. The empire that had built the largest religious structure on Earth was now tearing itself apart from the inside. And into that chaos, an old enemy was watching, waiting. The Cham people, the same maritime power that Jayavarman II had broken free from 4 centuries earlier, the same rival that Suryavarman had just spent years failing to conquer, were patient, and they were about to make the Khmer pay for every slight, every invasion, every failed campaign. What they did next would burn Angkor to the ground. But rising from those ashes would come the greatest king this empire ever produced, a man who had spent years in exile, who had watched his home kingdom destroy itself from a distance, and would return not as a conqueror, but something far more dangerous.
A man with nothing left to lose. That's where we're going next.